Thus begins one of the most dynamic first-person shooters of the late 90s. You play as Caleb, a merciless gunslinger from the 19th century, resurrected sometime in the 1920s and out for revenge after being betrayed and left for dead by his cult leader, Chernobyl. It's an opening that deftly sets the tone of the game, dark and moody, yet playful, gratuitously violent, but never mean-spiritedly so. The game is fast, thrilling, occasionally buggy, and fun. Its unique language of brooding atmosphere and splatterpunk carnivalesque rightfully earned it a reputation as a quality horror shooter, distinct from its contemporaries, Quake and Duke 3D. This much has already been said about Blood. Not so much has been said about its less well-received sequel, Blood 2: The Chosen. This short video will compare the two games, using the original as a template to measure where the sequel goes wrong. Blood 2's first noticeable departure from this established formula is in its setting. The sequel is set in 2028, 100 years after the events of the original game. You might think that on paper this is as unique a time period as Blood 1's quasi-historical period, but by the Chosen's reckoning, not a lot has changed in the 12 years from gaming's view of our present day. The early levels portray a decayed New York filled with gangsters and serial killers, a setting better created by Kingpin, which would be released a year later, and by Blood series developer Monolith's own condemned criminal origins. In other words, the Chosen's opening hour lacks uniqueness. Also, what floors me in this section is that Caleb, former top dog in a demonic death cult, is reduced to scavenging in bins for life essence, health pickups in the form of disembodied hearts, and trust me, given the difficulty of the first few chapters, you'll need them. It's like when you've thrown out this week's copy of the Radio Times instead of last week's, and you're frantically trying to get it back to see what time the bill's on at before the bin men come. There are forays into more historical settings in the game, the first being the exhibits of this museum, which appears to be run by Harley Quinn.
At 3 to 5 p.m. daily.
Also, things get a bit science fiction-y later on, when you get to the laboratories of Cobalco, an evil corporation run by the cult's new leader, and one of the titular Chosen, Gideon. But by then you'll have glazed over because of all this shooting to bland human enemies, with over-familiar weapons, and every so often you'll catch yourself asking if it's Aliens vs Predator 2 you're playing. This brings me to the second difference between the original Blood and its sequel: tone. The first game is gleeful, cathartic, and succeeds in balancing its camp grotesquerie with compelling gothic dread, never falling into something that feels exploitative or cynical. That's probably helped by the buffers provided by its links to other horror books and films, from literary ones like Lovecraft and Poe to the comedy excesses of the Evil Dead. By positioning itself among these texts, Blood ensures its mood never strays too far from theirs. Whenever you think it's going to take a turn for the serious, it reverts back to the ridiculous. In contrast, Blood 2 feels banal and strangely detached from its predecessor. I think this is another result of the uninspired enemies that are common throughout the game. The original keeps things light by pitting you against predominantly supernatural enemies, which directs the violence outwards, towards fantasy. Even the cultist monks are that wee bit removed from reality. The sequel has you killing a lot of generic, human enemies that wouldn't seem amiss in other shooters that don't have Blood's unique tone. It seems like it's trying to shoehorn that ridiculously overloaded violence into a more realistic setting, which it's at odds with. This even carries over to the later stages of the game, which play more like Blood 1's. Here you're spinning about these cathedrals shooting Cthulhu chickens. Maybe it's because polygons are a step away from the cartoonish sprites, and the tone suffered from the technological steps forward that the game was supposed to make to keep visual pace with the other shooters of the time. And this was all before developers had begun to experiment with merging fully 3D worlds with a comedy aesthetic. I guess the Time Splitters series was one of the first to do that. Anyway, I'm getting away from what I'm wanting to say here, which is that Blood 2: The Chosen is an odd game. Not odd as in, what is that? More like, why did they do that? There's so many choices the game makes that are out of place, almost like they weren't made by the developer, but by somebody else. Rather than your usual cannon fodder that occasionally get caught in the crossfire, non-competent civilians continually draw your attention to them, like they're trying to tell you something, but can't. It detracts from the compelling notion that it's just you against this horde of demons, that there are still social rules to the world even if it's supposed to have gone to hell. You can't just be Kelly anymore. Take a look at this band to see what I'm on about. I mean, look at them, screaming away. You don't like me?
Please, no.
Well, what if I go away and come back again? What about now? No?
Please, no.
What about now?
Please,
No? Oh, suit yourself. It sounds like I'm being overly critical of Blood 2, but in all honesty, I actually had quite a lot of fun with it. It's fast and smooth in a way I don't remember the Lithtech engine being, and, to be fair, there are some humorous details, like this Predator's alcove. He seems to be a spokesperson for Aliens vs Predator and Unreal. Can I pick that disc up? No, I can't. Is that the original Xbox logo? Blood's a series that, of all the old school shooters that are getting reboots, is the one that needs it most. Maybe next time we could have more of this, and less of this. More of this, and less of this. To finish with then, here's a bit where I'm floundering around in the sewers, as you so often do in these sorts of games. With all these valves and steam, it's almost as if the game, back in 1998, was warning us about the way titles would be marketed and sold in the future, in the only way it knew how to. If I were to give Blood 2 the chosen score, I'd give it 3 out of 5 and a packet of Monster Munch. Cheers!
Save it for someone who cares.
Is that anywhere to greet an old friend?
Things have changed, but I don't need to tell you that.